Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're literally reopening case file number 1 to dig into history's absolute greatest mystery, how the deadliest war the world had ever seen actually kicked off. Now, you've probably heard a version of this story before, right? But history has this funny habit of hiding the most fascinating, mind-blowing details right in plain sight.
So, let's jump straight into it. When we look back at the origins of the First World War, the standard textbook narrative is almost universally accepted. It's clean, it's straightforward, and honestly, it's kind of way too simple. As investigators today, our job isn't to just nod along with that neatly packaged summary. No, our job is to explore the massive gap between what we were all taught in school and the gritty, volatile reality of what actually went down.
I mean, think about the standard timeline we all know. It's so incredibly neat. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. Just days later, Europe declares war, and boom, World War I begins, bringing entire empires to their knees and costing millions of lives. It's presented as this perfect, clean sequence of cause and effect. But we literally can't accept this surface-level timeline. The truth is infinitely more complex and honestly, way more intriguing.
Which brings us to a massive, glaring question. If one single assassination was really enough to kickstart a global world war, why didn't the hundreds of other political assassinations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries trigger the exact same disaster? Why this specific one? Why did a localized regional squabble between Austria-Hungary and Serbia suddenly drag countries from every corner of the globe into absolute devastation? Well, the reality is the assassination wasn't the beginning at all. To find the real start, we've got to rewind decades into the past.
That brings us to Section 1, the illusion of prosperity, Europe in the early 1900s. To truly wrap our heads around the real story, we have to go back to well before a single shot was fired, to a time when the European continent looked completely, undeniably unstoppable. During this era, which a lot of people call the Belle Epoque, Europe looked like it was living through this unbelievable golden age. Cities were expanding like crazy, and factories were churning out record-breaking wealth. Everyday life was just being completely revolutionized by the industrial era. You had railroads seamlessly connecting nations that used to feel a million miles apart, and massive steamships crossing oceans faster than ever before. Picture the 1900 World's Fair in Paris, just this dazzling display of human progress and boundless optimism. But, and this is a big but, this brilliant era of technological and economic advancement was actually masking a super dangerous underlying lack of trust among the world's most powerful nations. Beneath all that deceptive calm, every single government was growing deeply, deeply paranoid about their neighbors. The balance of power was shifting. And as that realization really started to set in, the mood in the halls of power turned incredibly grim. Basically, every military leadership believed war was no longer just a possibility, but an absolute inevitability. And you know, when the leaders of the world's superpowers believe a massive, continent-spanning conflict is completely unavoidable, they don't just sit around twiddling their thumbs. They start preparing.
The real turning point here arrived in 1871. After unifying following a decisive victory in the Franco-Prussian War, Germany's economy didn't just grow, it absolutely exploded. Under some seriously ambitious leadership, they started rapidly outproducing their European rivals, building up one of the strongest, most ruthlessly efficient military and industrial complexes on the planet. Germany was rising so much faster than anyone had anticipated, and they firmly believed they deserved a spot at the very top, rightfully counted among the world's greatest empires. But they hit a major geopolitical roadblock. Britain already ruled the oceans with their unparalleled Royal Navy. France already controlled these vast, incredibly lucrative colonies stretching right across Africa and Asia. And Russia? Well, they possessed an enormous expanse of territory that gave them completely unmatched manpower. So when Germany stepped up and demanded their slice of global influence, those older established empires had absolutely zero intention of giving away their advantages. The geopolitical board was completely full, and nobody was willing to yield even a single inch of their power.
And this is exactly how an entire continent just slides toward disaster. What started out as pretty harmless economic and colonial competition over global markets quickly devolved into deep suspicion as power dynamics shifted. That suspicion then bred a paralyzing fear among the ruling monarchs and prime ministers. And ultimately, that fear locked these incredibly nervous nations into a massive, unprecedented arms race. The psychological shift from being just competitors to deeply paranoid adversaries was totally complete. It was like flipping a switch. Practically overnight, factories that were once dedicated to building machines for industry and wealth, like the massive Krupp steelworks in Germany, were completely transformed into engines of destruction. Governments started pouring billions, literally billions, into modern rifles, massive artillery shells, and a devastating new class of battleships called dreadnoughts. This sparked a totally furious naval race between Britain and Germany. Europe was no longer preparing for peace. They were stockpiling weapons for a war that nobody wanted to admit was actually coming.
But look, weapons alone, even literal mountains of them, don't start world wars. That brings us to Section 2, the perfect chain reaction, the entangled alliances. I want you to think of Europe during this time, not just as a continent of countries, but as a giant room absolutely filled to the brim with interconnected dominoes.
Through this ridiculously complex web of treaties, mostly split between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, those dominoes were lined up perfectly. Germany promised to defend Austria-Hungary. Russia pledged to defend their Slavic brothers in Serbia. France promised to stand with Russia to counter German power. And Britain, they were fundamentally tied to protecting Belgian neutrality and supporting France. This staggering geopolitical entanglement meant that if you knock down just one single piece, you guarantee the entire room is going down with it.
And here is the ultimate, tragic historical irony. These agreements were originally designed to prevent war through a delicate balance of power. The logic was basically simple deterrence. Nobody would ever dare attack one nation because they knew they'd instantly have to fight them all. Makes sense on paper, right? But instead, Europe had unwittingly built a highly volatile powder keg, binding their fates so incredibly tightly together that isolated, localized diplomacy became literally impossible. They built a trap, and it was just sitting there, waiting for the perfect excuse to spring shut.
Which leads us to Section 3. The final domino, Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia. This fateful spark finally appeared in a city that, honestly, at the time, very few people outside of Eastern Europe had ever even heard of.
So Bosnia was a region controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the Slavic people living there were heavily driven by nationalism, this incredibly powerful, burning desire to break free from imperial rule and join neighboring Serbia. This ideological wildfire spread so quickly through the Balkans. Secret organizations started emerging in the shadows, most notably a radical militant group known as the Black Hand, and they actively funded and fueled an entire generation of young revolutionaries who became utterly convinced that extreme violence was their only true path to freedom.
Among these young radicals was Gavrilo Princip. He was just a quiet, 19-year-old student, but history remembers him as the man who fired the fatal shots on June 28, 1914, taking down Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now here's the wild part. The assassination attempt that morning had actually totally failed. That is, until the Archduke's driver took a fateful wrong turn, stalling their open-top car directly in front of Princip by sheer unbelievable coincidence. With two pulls of the trigger, this teenager seemingly plunged the entire world into darkness. But as we've uncovered in our explainer today, Princip's bullet wasn't actually the true beginning of the war, was it? It was just the final domino falling in a chain reaction that took decades to build. Almost everyone knows what this 19-year-old student did on that fateful June morning. But the real mystery, that deep-rooted paranoia, the frantic industrial arms race, and the dangerous nationalist ideology that ultimately convinced a teenager he had to pull that trigger and ignite a continent? Well, that demands its own case file. So ask yourself, what other historical facts are just the final domino of a much larger story? Thank you so much for joining me on this investigation today, and remember, always question the history you think you know.